So I'm going to speak about the Declaration of Independence. The background here is the actual parchment that was written neatly and signed by the founders, and which starts at the top here, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. So first I'll start with the historical situation to give you a little background of what caused this desire for independence from Britain. So the 7 Years' War, which is what it was called in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it was called in North America, took place from 1756 to 1770 or 1763. And it was a global conflict between Britain and France and around the world. And in Europe, it was a conflict between different European powers for territory and succession to various thrones. So, but Britain and France were kind of the main players around the globe, and they fought it in North America, fought each other in North America, the Caribbean, the coast of Africa, and even all the way to India. So it was really ranging across the globe. And in the end, Britain was victorious in many places around the world, but it had large debts because of the war. And it wanted the American colonists to help pay for defeating the French. And the French who had been in Quebec and surrounding areas, northern New York, Ohio, western Pennsylvania. So because of this, Britain imposed a series of taxes without the consent of the colonies to help pay their debts from the French and Indian War, and also to support a standing army that Britain put in America. So having a standing army in America raised tensions among the colonists. First of all, why do we need a standing army here? And what is Britain oppress us with this army because it's already here, and they might as well use it if it's here. And it was, they were worried about what would happen with it. It was somewhat to protect them from the Indians, but they kind of thought that a isolated series of forts along the frontier wasn't really very good protection against the Indians, because they could just go around them and attack into the more parts of the colonies. So it wasn't much protection against the Indians. And it also cost a lot of money, 300,000 pounds a year to maintain this army. So the taxes, the war debt, and maintaining the standing army were raising tensions in the colonies. So they passed one tax, and then it was maybe taken away, and they'd pass another one or add another to it. And eventually they got to a tax on tea. And it's kind of interesting that the tax on tea, it was allowed only the monopoly East India Company, British East India Company, to sell tea. And even with the tax, it was cheaper than the tea that was smuggled in by the American smugglers. But on principle, they didn't want to pay the tax that only a monopoly company could sell in the colonies. So a group of colonists disguised as Indians in Boston Harbor boarded the ships with the tea and threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. So this very much upset the British and the king, and he declared this was an act of treason. So for this act, Britain closed the Boston Harbor to all trade. No ship at all of any sort was allowed to come in or out of Boston Harbor. And so this was, kind of a death sentence for Boston, that had been a major port and shipping center. And all of a sudden, everything was closed down. So some of the other colonies sent aid to Massachusetts to help them resist against this awful closing of their harbor. So they sent food and such so that the people there wouldn't starve. So tensions were very high, especially in Boston. And a lot of people were out of work because they weren't loading and unloading ships and transporting things around the world. So the British troops were occupying Boston to enforce this. And on the night of April 18th, 1775, they sent what was supposed to be a secret raid of British soldiers out to Concord, Massachusetts. And because there were so many people hanging about, it didn't remain a secret long. And Paul Revere began his midnight ride to go warn the colonists that the British were coming. The British regulars were coming. And so he made his famous midnight ride, and the Minutemen were gathering. The local militias were gathering on the town green in Lexington and marching towards Concord. And the Minutemen on the Lexington Green came and stood their ground on the green to oppose the British. And the British came up and ordered them to go home, to retreat, but they wouldn't. They stood their ground. And then some shot got fired. It's not clear who fired it, but anyway, a shot was fired, and then everyone started firing. And 8 men from Lexington were killed on Lexington Green that morning. And the British, routed them out of the way and marched on to Concord. But those were the first shots of the American Revolution. And then more shots in Concord, and all the way back, more and more Minutemen came and started attacking the British because the war was on. So during this time, the Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia and had appointed George Washington as the general of the Continental Army. So George Washington came up to Massachusetts and started training and leading the army, and they won a victory over the British at the Battle of Bunker Hill just outside Boston. And eventually, by 1776, the British were driven out of Boston. So interesting stories on that, but we'll continue. So in 1776, after more than a year of the war going on, Congress started debating a resolution on independence. So it wasn't just the day the war broke out, it was more than a year later. And it's good to keep in mind that the war continued another 5 years until the British surrendered at Yorktown. So, the Declaration of Independence is more than a year into the war, but 5 years before it ends. So just to put things in context. So for the purpose of the Declaration, it starts out, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. So they're declaring to the world of the causes that make them desire to separate from Britain. So, they're not just upset and picking things and rioting. They're saying we have causes and we're going to state them here. And they're appealing to the laws of nature and of nature's God, that they have the right to become a new nation that is equal in status to the other nations. So they're saying, we're going to break our bonds with England, and we're going to become a new nation, and we'll be equal with other nations. So it goes on to talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Probably the most famous phrase or sentence in the Declaration is this one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So first of all, they say this is self-evident truth. So it's pre-existing and it's obvious. And importantly, it's not granted by government. They're not asking for these rights, or they pre-exist. They've existed for all time. It's unchanging truth, and it should be evident. And they say all men are created equal. So we have no classes in our population. In England, they had the king and the various classes of nobles, and then the commoners at the bottom. But in our society, they said, well, we're not going to have classes. According to Psalm 22:2, rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. So we are all equal before God. It's not like the king it's higher than the rest of us. And they say we're endowed by their Creator. So our rights are from God. They can't be revoked by men, because they're granted from God. So they're not asking the king for these rights, or asking a government for these rights. These rights are from God. And they say the rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So people have the right to their life and the liberty to live it as they wish. And it says among these, so this is not the limit of our rights, but it's a pretty broad, inclusive list here. But not down to the specifics, but if you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that gives you a lot of freedom, but that's not the limit of our rights. And they continue on talking about the consent of the governed. So they say, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So governments are established to secure our God-given rights. So the government doesn't give the rights exist from God, and the government is just to secure these. So the reason for government to exist is to protect our rights. And it says they're deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So governments, the power lies with the people, and some of that power is given to a government, a limited amount, for them to conduct, government to secure our rights. But the power starts with the people, and they can give part of that to the government. But the power of the government should be limited. And it continues that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So they're saying people have a right to establish a new government that serves them, that will protect their rights, and they have the right to set it up in the manner they see fit. So again, they're emphasizing the people have the power. So they have a list of grievances. These are their reasons. They said we're going to appeal, to mankind, to the world, what our reasons are for this. So they say the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So they're saying a usurpation, if you usurp the king, you overthrow the king and illegally take authority that doesn't belong to you, that's usurpation. So here they're saying the king is usurping their proper rights, which is kind of interesting because usually a king would be the one that would be usurped, which would be thrown out. But in this case, they're saying the king himself is usurping their rights. So they have a list of 27 items, which I'll condense to fewer, but 27 ways that the king has established a tyranny. So the king has refused to give assent to laws and has dissolved legislatures. So they had legislatures in the colonies for 150 years, and they were operating, they would pass laws and such, but the laws needed the king's assent. And the king had stopped giving assent, so they couldn't be enacting laws that they needed because the king wasn't giving his consent. And the king had also dissolved their legislatures that they had for a long time. And the king obstructed justice and made judges dependent on the king. So he was preventing fair judgments in cases to be carried out. And here's one that I quote verbatim because I like the way they put it. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. So I think this is a marvelous picture of too many regulators, too many bureaucrats coming and sticking their nose into people's businesses and causing, undue burden, harassment of the people, eating out the people's substance. So I think this might apply to much of our bureaucracy today. But they were complaining about too many of the king's officers coming and harassing people. Also, a standing army in peacetime. They thought that was, it was okay to have an army in war, but why do you need one in peacetime? So they objected to that. And the army had been made superior to civil power and was protected from real trials. And also soldiers were quartered in people's homes. So, they would just tell people, you're going to keep this soldier and give him a bed and feed him. And you're going to keep a soldier too. And, it wasn't an option. It was just forced on people. So because of that, we have the Third Amendment to our Constitution is no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So today you don't hear many people saying, Third Amendment rights, Third Amendment rights. But at the time, quartering soldiers in people's house without their permission, their consent, was very, a big deal. How would you like to just say, have a unwelcome British soldier stay in your house? So that's why we have our Third Amendment. The grievances continue, cutting off trade with the world. So Britain forbid America to trade with anyone except Britain directly. They couldn't trade with other countries. Also imposing taxes without our consent. Now, taxes were kind of a big deal leading up to this, and sometimes we think taxes were the only issue, but here it's only one of 27 different grievances they bring up, and it's not top of the list or anything. It's just one of many. So, although it was a contributing factor, it wasn't the only thing, the only grievance they had. The king also deprived them of trial by jury. So, in English common law, if you were accused of a crime, and in our legal system today, which we inherit from British common law, if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to trial by a jury of your peers. And the king had deprived them of that. And he, the king, has waged war on us, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of people. So remember, this was more than a year into the war. So the king was fighting against them. So, and he's transporting foreign mercenaries to cruelly fight against us. So the king also brought over some Hessian, it's an area of Germany, Hessian mercenaries to help in the fight against the rebels. So, and he's captured sailors and forced them to fight against their brethren. So if they would capture an American ship, they'd tell the sailors, okay, you're all now in the British Navy and you'll have to fight. So no option. And he excites insurrections and encourages the Indians to attack the frontiers. So they had a long list of grievances, and they state each one here. And they say, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So they say, we've peaceably tried to address these issues, we've brought them up, and not only have you not resolved them, you've just added more injury. They would keep passing more taxes and more onerous laws on the colonies. So they tried the peaceful route and it didn't work. So thus they come to the point of declaring independence. And they say, if the king is acting as a tyrant, he's unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So they say again, the people are free, the people have the rights. So that's just an ongoing theme, that the rights are with the people. So we come to independence, and they say, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. So they start out saying we're representatives of the good people. So the reason they can say this is because they're the representatives of the people. So again, the power lies with the people, but their representatives can state these this claim of independence. And also they're appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. So they're appealing that the case is presented to mankind and to God, and they're pleading that their cause is just. They've laid out their reasons, and they say, okay, this is why we want to become independent, and they're confident that their cause is just. So they're willing to appeal to God and to the world, to mankind. And they say these united colonies are free and independent states. So as they stated in the beginning, they've assumed their equal station as an independent nation. So they've mentioned God 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. So first they say the laws of nature and of nature's God. So talking about God as the lawgiver or the legislative function, endowed by their creator. The creator would be their king, which would be the executive function. And the supreme judge of the world, as we saw on the last page, God is the judge of the world, the judicial function. And they also say protection of divine providence. So God is our provider and protector. So from Isaiah 33:22, it says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us." So directly from Scripture, they see that God has the function of judge, lawgiver, and king. And so they acknowledge God in all three of those roles. And we see those three different roles reflected in our Constitution as the three branches of government. So in God, all these powers are unified in our one God. However, in government, they separate those different functions into three branches of government because, as Mingy had reviewed, man is fallen, we're sinful, and we can't trust any one person to have all the power. So they split these separate functions, these governmental powers, into different branches as they write the Constitution. So, but they also recognize that in God, they're all unified. God has all of these powers. So here's a picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So what is depicted here, actually, it's the presentation on June 28th, 1776, of the drafting committee to the whole Congress. So this is the Second Continental Congress, and standing in the middle here is the committee that drafted the Constitution, or the Declaration. So on the left is John Adams, who becomes the second president of the United States. Then next to him is Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. So Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States, and Benjamin Franklin is very involved in the founding of the nation. And they're presenting their draft. So you see is holding the draft and present to the seated gentleman here is John Hancock. He was the president of the Continental Congress. So they're presenting the draft on June 28th. They debate for a few days whether to vote for independence or not. On January 2nd, 1776, the Congress votes for independence. They vote 12-0 with New York abstaining. But the other 12 colonies all vote for independence. And later, New York changes their mind and votes for it as well. And then they revised the draft that Jefferson had written with input, especially from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And by July 4th, they've completed their revisions of the draft, and they publish what we've just looked through, the Declaration of Independence. So July 4th, 1776 becomes the birthday of our country because they've approved this Declaration of Independence. And then they had it written nicely on a piece of parchment, and on August 2nd, they all came up and signed it. So they closed the declaration with this line: "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." So we see that line written right here. And below it, John Hancock, in very large letters, writes his name. He writes it first because he's the president, so he's already at the table. So he signs his name. He says large enough so that King George III of Britain doesn't need his glasses to read it. And then we see down here, Thomas Jefferson signed it, T.H. Jefferson. And Benjamin Rush signed it here. Benjamin Rush from Pennsylvania wrote, "Of the pensive and awful silence which pervaded the House when we were called up, one after another, to the table of the President of Congress to sign what was believed by many at the time to be our own death warrants." So remember, they were revolting against the King of Britain, and Britain at that time was the most powerful country in the world. So it was the superpower of the day. And here they were declaring themselves independent, and the king called them traitors. And they were signing their names saying, yes, I'm a traitor. So, quite likely they were signing their own death warrant if the revolution had failed. And Benjamin Franklin joked about this. He said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately." So it was a very serious thing, and they were really laying everything on the line when they were signing this document.